Alexander Parker Crittenden was born in 1816 in Lexington, Kentucky, to Thomas Turpin Crittenden and Mary Wilson Parker. He was the nephew of John Jordan Crittenden and the grandson of John Crittenden Sr. Crittenden graduated from West Point in 1836 at the age of 20. Although he had been expelled for a prank, he successfully appealed to President Andrew Jackson for reinstatement. He joined the Army as a lieutenant of artillery, but quickly resigned his commission. He then worked as an engineer for railroad companies. In 1838, he married Clara Churchill Jones, and together they had 14 children, 8 of whom survived to adulthood. In 1839, the family moved to Brazoria County, Texas, where Crittenden studied law, was admitted to the bar, and began practicing. In 1849, seeking wealth, he traveled on horseback through Mexico and Arizona to Los Angeles, California, with companions including James Audubon and his brother-in-law, Dr. Alexander Jones, who was injured in a fight in Tucson, Arizona. Arriving nearly penniless in Los Angeles, Crittenden was elected to the first California legislature and was able to fund his trip to San Jose. He chaired the Judiciary Committee in the first and second state assemblies, authored legislation to incorporate the city of Los Angeles, and introduced English common law into California statutes. In 1852, his wife Clara joined him in San Clara County, California, traveling via Panama with 6 children and 2 servants. Crittenden established a law practice in San Francisco under the firm Crittenden and Randolph, serving as counsel in 26 California Supreme Court cases. In 1861, Alexander Parker Crittenden became the leader of the Southern wing of the California Democratic Party and chairman for the state Southern Democratic Central Committee, which had Confederate sympathies. In 1863, after refusing to take a wartime oath of allegiance to the federal government, he moved to Virginia City, Nevada Territory with his brother-in-law, Todd Robinson. There, he handled mining claims and speculated in mining stocks, living in Virginia City and Aurora. Crittenden's wife, Clara, stayed in San Francisco and assisted the wife of Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnson. Laura Ann Hunt was born in Holly Springs, Mississippi on June 22, 1837. Her family was small and traveled around the southern United States during her childhood, eventually settling in New Orleans. At the age of 16, in 1853, she married her first husband, 36-year-old William H. Stone, an alcohol dealer from New Orleans. He died in 1854. Laura then attended the Covenant of Visitation to become a teacher, but left after a year to marry Thomas Gratian. However, she soon abandoned him and joined her mother in operating a boarding house in San Francisco around 1856 or 1857. After moving to Shasta, California, she met her third husband, Sheriff William D. Fair. 3 years later, the couple separated, and Fair committed suicide in 1861, leaving Laura to support herself, her young daughter, and her mother. They initially opened a boarding house in Sacramento, but it was unsuccessful. They then returned to San Francisco, where Laura briefly worked as an actress. In 1870, she was briefly married to Jesse Snyder for a few months. In September of 1862, Laura Fair opened a 37-room Tahoe House Hotel in Virginia City, Nevada, on South C Street following the discovery of silver in the nearby hills. In 1863, Fair began a relationship with local lawyer Alexander Parker Crittenden, who falsely claimed to be single and a widower. When Fair discovered the truth, Crittenden promised to divorce his wife, Clara Churchill Jones. The relationship between Fair and Crittenden lasted 7 years. In 1870, Clara Jones took a long train journey to the east coast of the United States to reunite with her 2 youngest children. Upon learning that Crittenden was going to meet his wife in Oakland, California, and then board a ferry back to San Francisco, Fair caught the same ferry on November 3, 1870, and shot Crittenden in the heart. He died the next day on November 5, 1870. In April of 1871, Laura Fair faced her first trial, claiming that the shooting was the result of temporary insanity caused by a severely painful menstrual cycle. The prosecution portrayed her as a fallen woman who had seduced Crittenden and warned the jury of their moral obligation. While in jail, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton visited Fair to support her. The jury found Fair guilty of murder, and she was sentenced to hang on July 28, 1871. Fair's case was appealed with the support of suffragettes, including Emily Pitts Stevens, founder of the California Women's Suffrage Association. The conviction was overturned on the grounds of prejudice. The press, having initially supported the conviction, was decidedly upset, calling the acquittal a shameful miscarriage of justice. In the second trial, Fair was acquitted. She went on to work in San Francisco as a book agent. Laura Fair passed away on October 19, 1919, at the age of 82 in San Francisco. She was buried in an unmarked grave at Woodlawn Memorial Park Cemetery. Mary Ann Evarts Wright, known by her middle name Ann, was born in Fayetteville, North Carolina. She lived there for several years with her first husband until his death in a railroad accident. Ann then moved to Pleasant Hill, Illinois, and eventually to St. Paul, Minnesota in April of 1858 at the request of her nephew, John Walker, who was ill with typhoid fever. Soon after arriving in St. Paul, Ann married Stanislaus Belansky, one of the first Polish immigrants to settle in the area. Stanislaus had moved to St. Paul from Wisconsin in 1848. Despite his heavy drinking and poverty, he owned a small cabin that served as both a bar and grocery store. He had custody of his 3 young children after his second wife divorced him, and Ann often cared for them when Stanislaus was ill or working. In early March of 1859, Stanislaus fell ill with what was initially thought to be indigestion. His condition rapidly worsened as he consumed both alcohol and Grafenberg pills. Ann was seen weeping at his bedside, asking what she should do with the children if anything happened to him. Stanislaus died on March 11, 1859. As the funeral procession was leaving the Belansky residence to bury Stanislaus, officials from the Ramsey County Coroner's Office arrived to conduct an inquest. A doctor examined the body, and a coroner's jury was assembled to hear testimony from John Walker, a visiting neighbor named Lucinda Kilpatrick, and a housekeeper hired during Stanislaus's illness named Rosa Scharf. The coroner's jury found that Stanislaus had died of natural causes, but questioned why Ann had not called a doctor towards the end of his illness. Stanislaus was buried on March 12th, but that evening, Kilpatrick changed her testimony, claiming that she saw Ann buying arsenic from a drugstore on February 28th. Ann claimed the purchase was at Stanislaus's urging to kill rats in the cellar. After taking Kilpatrick's new testimony, Stanislaus's body was exhumed for an examination, and on March 13th, Ann was arrested for the murder of her husband. A second coroner's jury convened to hear the testimonies of Scharf and Kilpatrick, as well as from druggist W.H. Wolfe and Dr. J.D. Goodrich. Wolfe testified that a single crystal found under a microscope resembled arsenic, but Goodrich was skeptical that Stanislaus had been poisoned. Despite this, the jury concluded that Stanislaus had died of arsenic poisoning, leading to Ann's indictment for murder and a trial date set for May 23rd. The trial was conducted at the Ramsey County Courthouse with the prosecution led by Isaac Hurd. The case against Ann included 3 main arguments. She had purchased arsenic and thus had the means to kill. She had inappropriate relations with Walker, suggesting an affair as a motive for murder, and she had made comments indicating she was contemplating murder. Kilpatrick was the state's principal witness, and Hurd also relied heavily on Scharf's testimony, which stated that Ann had made all of Stanislaus's meals separately and washed his dishes and utensils separately. Scharf also testified that Belansky did not treat Stanislaus as a husband should be treated. Both Kilpatrick and Scharf testified that Ann was having an affair with Walker, which County Attorney Hurd argued was the motive for murder. After all the witnesses had spoken, an all-male jury began deliberations on June 3rd, taking less than 6 hours to return a guilty verdict. Upon hearing the verdict, Ann reportedly showed no visible signs of emotion or distress. Ann's defense asked for a new trial, but the request was denied as the judge considered her already found guilty. Belansky's attorney went before the Minnesota Supreme Court to try and prevent the judge from imposing the death penalty, but the justices declined to intervene. Ann briefly escaped from the county jail on July 25th, hid near Como Lake, and eventually made contact with Walker, but she was recaptured in his company on August 1st. On December 2nd, Ann appeared in court for her sentencing, proclaiming her innocence. "If I die in this case, I die an innocent woman. I don't think I have had a fair and just trial." She was sentenced to 1 month in solitary confinement, followed by death by hanging. Governor Henry Sibley had the legal responsibility of setting the execution date, but he refused to do so or commute the sentence, allowing his term to expire at the end of 1859. The Minnesota House of Representatives made efforts to abolish capital punishment, but these were quickly rejected. On January 18, 1860, another bill was introduced to prohibit the execution of women, but was tabled.
On January 25, 1860, newly elected Governor Alexander Ramsey set Anne's execution date for March 23, 1860. Another bill was passed by the state legislature on March 5th trying to help Anne, stating that the first execution by Minnesota should not be that of a woman and that Anne had an unfair trial, but Governor Ramsey vetoed this on March 8th. Anne requested a private execution, but during the 19th century, public executions were typical, serving both civil and religious purposes to deter crime and demonstrate the danger of sin. On March 23, 1860, gallows were set up in an enclosure in Courthouse Square at the corner of 5th and Cedar Streets. Just before her execution, Anne spoke her last words, "I die without having had any mercy shown me or justice. I die for the good of my soul, and not for murder. Your courts of justice are not courts of justice, but I will yet get justice in heaven." Around 100 onlookers watched from inside the enclosure, while thousands more observed from outside. Anne's body was left to hang for 20 minutes before being buried in an unmarked grave in Calvary Cemetery. Emma Cunningham was a young woman in New York City when she married widower George Cunningham in 1835. Upon his death in 1852, she received a life insurance payout of $10,000, a significant sum at the time. As an attractive widow, Emma met Dr. Harvey Burdell, a prosperous dentist, and rented a suite of rooms in his mansion. Other tenants, such as John J. Eckel, also lived there. Eckel would later be accused as an accessory. It was rumored that Cunningham was romantically involved with both men. Dr. Burdell lived and practiced dentistry at his townhouse on 31 Bond Street in New York City, one of the most affluent blocks in pre-Civil War New York. However, this area declined rapidly in the mid-19th century, and only a few of the 35 Greek Revival homes remain. Burdell was wealthy like his neighbors, but his reputation was tarnished by accusations of embezzlement, reneging on debts, and causing a scandal on his wedding day by demanding money from the bride's father, who became enraged and canceled the wedding. On the morning of January 31, 1857, Dr. Burdell's servants discovered his body in his office at 31 Bond Street. He was brutally stabbed multiple times and strangled, with his body covered in blood. During police interrogation, some of the servants testified that they had heard angry words between the victim and his assailant the night before. The police determined that Dr. Burdell had been stabbed at least 15 times by a left-handed assailant. Since Emma Cunningham was left-handed, she became an immediate suspect, leading to her arrest and imprisonment pending trial for Burdell's murder. The trial of Emma Cunningham was as notorious in its time as the O.J. Simpson trial was in the 1990s, attracting intense media attention. A reputed 8,000 people attempted to attend Burdell's funeral, where Cunningham reportedly threw herself dramatically on his casket. On the first evening of the coroner's investigation, January 31, 1857, Miss Cunningham presented a marriage certificate showing that she and Dr. Burdell had been married on October 28, 1856. This provided a suspected motive for murder, as she would inherit his fortune as his wife. Dr. Burdell's estate, including the townhouse where he was murdered, and various other properties, was estimated at $100,000. Following custom, Coroner Edward Connery placed all household members, including servants and Cunningham's family, under house arrest. After a 14-day investigation conducted in the parlor of 31 Bond Street, the case was presented to a grand jury, and Emma Cunningham was indicted for Dr. Burdell's murder. She was jailed awaiting trial, represented by top defense attorney Henry Loren Clinton, while the prosecution was led by New York City District Attorney Abraham Oakley Hall, who later became mayor of New York City in 1869. The murder trial began in May of 1857, featuring extensive testimony from various parties, although Cunningham herself did not testify. One of Burdell's maids testified that Cunningham had called him a bad man who was not fit to live. John Eckel, a boarder at Burdell's home, was labeled an accessory to the murder, but testimony regarding his actions was not presented during Cunningham's trial. Additionally, testimony concerning the marriage certificate was not heard, as its validity was being examined in the surrogate's court. Burdell's widely known unsavory reputation complicated the prosecution's case against Cunningham. On May 9, 1857, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty, and Cunningham was released. After Emma Cunningham's acquittal, she was allowed to return to the townhouse on 31 Bond Street, pending a hearing in the surrogate's court to determine the validity of her marriage to Dr. Harvey Burdell and whether it entitled her to his house and other property. At the time, marriages were conducted by clergymen and witnessed, but were not registered with the state. The questioned marriage certificate was signed by a clergyman, both parties, and 2 witnesses, and the clergyman recalled the event. The only way to invalidate the marriage was to prove that an impostor, not Dr. Burdell, had been married. The surrogate's decision was scheduled for August of 1857. Before that decision, a scandal erupted involving Emma Cunningham. District Attorney Oakley Hall claimed that Cunningham had procured a baby paying $1,000 to declare a false heir, with Dr. Burdell as the father. This would entitle her to all of Burdell's fortune instead of just a widow's share. The prosecutor and chief of police raided her home, finding Cunningham delirious and under the influence of drugs, along with a doctor and a baby. The baby scam had been engineered by the district attorney, and the doctor who testified was his close associate, Dr. De La Montagne, also the godfather of Hall's daughter. Cunningham was briefly taken to the Tombs, New York City's jail, where she had already spent 2 months awaiting the murder trial. Her defense attorney, Henry Clinton, quickly had the charges dismissed due to lack of evidence and entrapment. Cunningham was released again. Whether the baby scam was fabricated by the district attorney or if Cunningham was delusional and attempted to buy an heir remains unclear. It would have been an unlikely move since she was already in line to share a significant fortune with Burdell's relatives. All testimony and reports of her claimed pregnancy were hearsay and never verified. However, the judge in the surrogate's case was negatively influenced by the incident and ruled that Emma Cunningham, although acquitted of wrongdoing, would not inherit any money or property from Burdell's estate. From August of 1857 onward, Emma Cunningham was a free woman, but her reputation was forever tainted by the murder scandal. By the end of the year, she was penniless and eventually moved to the West Coast. She returned to New York City in 1887 and died at the home of a cousin at age 69. Her death was reported in the New York Times on September 18, 1887.